Hello, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director of the Illinois Principals Association. Thank you so much for joining me for this IPA talk. Today, I'm very fortunate to have with me as my guest a former alum of the IPA Board of Directors, former high school principal at Carbondale Community High School, which is actually where I student taught years ago, which is a whole other IPA talk, but now the superintendent of Carbondale Elementary Schools District number 95. Daniel Booth. Daniel, thanks for joining me for this IPA talk.
Hey, always a pleasure. IPA holds a special place in my heart. I learned so much while being a principal and also being on the board of directors, and I've got lifelong friends from my stint of service there. So thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. And just to let people know, you served as our legislative chair there for a few years, and it was really a short period of time, too short in my opinion, Daniel, before you were recruited from your high school principal's duties to take over as the superintendent there at Carbondale Elementary. But I'll just lament and remiss on the time frame that we had with you. But we're here to talk about, this historic year that we've had, historic school year from the pandemic perspective, and then, historic with regards to the social issues that we've been dealing, post the killing of George Floyd and obviously, the elevation of racial tension that we still are experiencing in this country right now. And I guess, my first question to you is just, as an African-American man, African-American school leader, how you doing?
Hey, well, I appreciate you asking that. We know as school leaders, we're often the caregivers and we put ourselves last.
Yep.
But this time of life has really caused me to reflect on just that question, how I'm doing, and not only as an educator and as a superintendent, but as a father. As a father of a 4-year-old girl and a 6-year-old boy, and how I can lead them through this time of just questions and of reflection of how the state of our country is right now. And to be honest with you, Jason, I have had times during this period of life where I've been extremely reflective of my own childhood and some of the things that I saw and some of the things that I dealt with growing up in Peoria, Illinois, on the south side of town, which is seen as right now today is one of the poorest communities in the state of Illinois. The life expectancy in the 61605 zip code of Peoria, Illinois is one of the lowest in the state of Illinois. And that's where I grew up. So the disparities, the racial disparities, I see it when I travel home to visit my parents who still live right around the corner from Peoria Manual High School. And it also brought up some feelings that I suppressed in life. I can remember vividly being a teenager, riding around with friends and being pulled over for no good reason and pulled out of cars and cars being searched with no questions. And I can think back to those moments, and what I felt at that time was fear, and a fear of not knowing why, but also feeling like it was just the way that things were. And when I look at the state of our country right now, I think there's an awakening occurring to let people know that that's not the way that things should be. And as school leaders, the best thing that we have to hang our hats on is the fact that we can have the opportunity to be a change for our students and for our faculty and educating them on how we can change things.
So let me ask you this, Daniel, just thinking about this personally for you for a moment. So two things I'll ask you to let you respond before I move on to the second one. But you have a few brothers. You have 3, if I'm correct, right? So you're one of 4 boys in your family. Any other siblings?
I've got two brothers and a sister.
Okay, sorry. I guess I'm thinking of maybe some brother-in-laws or something like that, right? Maybe. But I do know that you're very close with your siblings, particularly your brothers. At least that's who I've heard you talk about, right? Have you had any conversations really with them, and just what has that been like when you're talking with them right now?
Yeah, my second oldest brother is actually he's a public school educator. Yeah. He works for Peoria Public Schools, and his title is Director of Social Emotional Health. So his main work is to service and give wraparound services to the community of Peoria, specifically that 61605 zip code, and to bring some level of equity to make sure that the people that need help the most are receiving it, whether that is parole officer services being in the neighborhood, a doctor being in the neighborhood, counseling service and mental health being in the neighborhood. So we often talk about the lack of services that there are, and the how a lot of times traumatic events and mental health has a stigma aligned to it that we have to figure out how to take that stigma away. Having a mental health issue is no different than having a sore back. You've got to treat it for it to get better. So we talk about this all the time, and just this recently over Father's Day, I was back in Peoria and we were having the same conversation on his back porch of how can we ensure that our voice is being heard in serving our communities. And the biggest thing that we always come back to is how important it is for us to speak into the lives of our young African-American children. How important it is when we see a glimmer of potential in someone, how important it is for us to say to them, you'd be a great teacher. You'd be a great coach. And the fact that that may be a passing thought in our mind, but that thought being expressed in action can actually be the catalyst to take someone from where they are to where they never thought they would be. So we are very, very intentional about when we see potential in someone, even if it's a little glimmer of potential of leadership, sharing it with that young person, because it can take them from where they are to being a leader in our very communities.
Well, that's interesting. And I want to later in our conversation talk a little bit about the equity work that you've helped us with here at IPA on that very issue as we think about the lack of African-American, Latinx leaders and educators generally in our profession right now, especially when you compare that to the number of African-American, Latinx students that we've got in our schools. We're really missing the mark. So I want to circle back around to that. And by the way, before I ask you the second question, related to your family, I want to make sure to give your sister a shout out. I sure don't want to miss that. So, because they may be all be watching. So what's her name? Just so we got it.
My sister Devin is all of my brothers are in a human and siblings are in a human service field at some point. My oldest brother, David, actually, a press release just went out yesterday, was hired to be a vice president of the National Basketball Association.
I saw that on Twitter. That's awesome.
Yeah. So
can you go to any game you want now? Is that?
You know what? We probably won't have to pay taxes on the tickets, but
I bet that's right. Yeah, I hear you.
But he does that. Like I said, my second brother is in the education field, and my sister actually is a DCFS investigator.
Wow.
Before that, she was a juvenile parole officer. Our parents really raised us to give back. And to give back in one way or another. And we've all got degrees. Neither one of our parents have college degrees, but they made sure all of their kids do. They taught us really, really early that we have a purpose in this life. And that purpose goes far beyond us getting a check every 2 weeks or once a month. That purpose is to make a difference that lasts way beyond our time on this earth. And that's what we're working to do. That's
terrific. So the other question I had, Daniel, you mentioned your two kids, and I know they're young, being 6 and 4 right now, and I don't have kids that young anymore, but I'm having conversations with my own children about things that are happening currently. Have you had any dialogue with them at this point in time, or I'm just kind of curious about that as you referenced them earlier?
Yeah, it is such a trip, Jason, how perceptive they are even at that age.
Yeah.
Both of my kids, both 4 and 6-year-old, know what coronavirus is. Mm-hmm. They know why we wear masks in public. And they also have been perceptive enough to recognize the conversations about race and police officers on the news. Mm-hmm. And my conversations with them have really been in the vein of making sure that what they see on TV and what they hear, ensuring that they are not afraid of police officers, ensuring that they aren't afraid of people that are different than them, and ensuring that they know that in our world and in this world, that their job is to, when they see something wrong, to speak up about it.
Right.
And early on, it's important that they know that because I never want them in a position to see something wrong or to feel in their gut. I talk to them about following their gut. What do you feel? How does that feel? And if something doesn't feel right, they know that they need to let mommy and daddy know. Yeah. And it's been big conversations for us, and it's age appropriate. We've got to be age appropriate, and for 4 and 6 year olds, they get that.
Yeah, that's terrific. Well, let's move on here a little bit. Daniel, and just think about yourself as a school leader in this moment, as an African American school leader in this moment, particularly there in your community. Through our brief conversation that we had a few days ago, and talking through the possibility of having this IPA talk, you were just sharing with me some of the conversations you're even having right now with individuals that are reaching out to you. And I appreciate you doing that, because I know that that's not always easy, as you're working through your own emotions within the situation. So would you mind talking a little bit about that, and maybe also just, giving the context of how you're helping people work through, particularly, white individuals such as myself, helping them understand things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise, with regards to your own experience?
Yeah, Jason, I've probably had over a dozen counterparts from across the state, all dozen of them being Caucasian, middle-aged men that are educators and whose eyes have been opened through the state of our country as to the inequities that truly are taking place. And we know that in our state, through the Every Student Succeeds Act, equity has been a conversation that has been happening. Mm-hmm. But I think that conversation has been accelerated now with the racial understanding that many people are having right now, and seeing some of the problems that our country still has today. So the main question that I think that I've had to help people understand is, or that even people have somewhat struggled with, is the concept of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Because innately, our mind automatically tells us, well, all lives should matter. And the fact of the matter is that is a true statement. All lives should matter. Yeah. But the question that we have to ask ourselves when we look at the history of our country is, have all lives always mattered? Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter, when we look at our history, is that it hasn't. When we look at 400 or 500 years ago, when Africans were put on a boat and shipped to the United States and sold on auction blocks to work in fields, all lives didn't matter. Yeah. When the Civil War was fought, our country fought against itself, the North and the South, to continue the practice of slavery in the United States of America. At that time, all lives didn't matter. And that ended in 1865. And you fast forward from that war to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, 100 years later, where African Americans, Black people, could eat there but not eat there, could sit there but not sit there, could drink there but not drink there, could use that bathroom but not that bathroom, had to fight to vote. The fact of the matter is that all lives didn't matter in the 1960s in our country. And when we say the 1960s and we recognize that that was really 55 to 60 years ago, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, within this last 55 to 60 years, when did all lives begin to matter? And for some people, they might say a month ago.
Yeah.
So when we talk about what the Black Lives Matter words mean, it's really a recognition of our country's history and the fact that Black lives haven't always mattered. And if they have mattered, they haven't mattered at the same level of everybody else. Yeah. It's a recognition and an understanding that for our country to reach its full potential, we have to first own up to the fact that the way that African Americans have been treated in our country for years and years and years has not been the same as white people.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, Dan, just for me personally, as I'm sitting here listening to you talk and just reflecting for myself, I grew up in a small rural community, pretty much mostly white. The schools that I led were mostly white or taught in were that. And while I would say that, racism is maybe something I've never ascribed to, of course, but still having to work through my own personal biases, right? And while I think that maybe I've thought about those over the years, especially here in my role at IPA and the things that we've been trying to do, that's been good. But I will tell you that obviously when you think about the moment that we're in, it sure has caused for me to reflect more deeply on myself. And I think what's been most important for me personally has been just to make sure that I'm listening to voices that I'm not traditionally listening to. It's not that they would make me uncomfortable. It's just I haven't even been intentional about doing it, right? And so that's been really good for me, which I've appreciated. And some of those voices that I've been listening to lately are the books that I read through audio more than anything anymore, because I can do it while I'm working or working out, whatever that might be. Occasionally they're making me uncomfortable because it's like a gut check, like, I need to step it up in this area or be better in this area as well. I'm just curious, Daniel, and we don't need to spend too much time here, but what's been the reaction to those conversations that you've been having, when you reference those 12 colleagues from throughout the state? How have they received what you've had to say?
You know what? I have heard deep reflection occurring. I've even had situations where people have been emotional. And the other thing that I've heard from people has been almost a little bit of guilt for not recognizing that over time. They feel like they've been lied to all their life, almost like the history that they thought or the world that they thought they lived in is different than what they had perceived it to be. And it is. Yeah. And those are good things. This is a great moment in time when we can recognize when almost the scales fall off of our eyes and we're able to see things in a different light. So I have been, every single one of them called me because they know that I know their heart. And they know that I know that they are good people. They know that I know that educators in general are social justice people. When they see something going wrong, they want to figure out how to fix it. And I think they've even been a little bit irritated with themselves as, in a manner of saying, like, how didn't I see this before? Because if I would have saw it before, I would have done something then. What can I do to help right now? Yeah. And my conversation with them when they ask that question is, you know what? It's really, really important for you as a leader to get ahead of your organization. We can't lead with people when we're trying to answer these questions or we're trying to work through this. We can't lead from behind. We've got to get ahead. And when you talk about being reflective and you talk about reading books and even asking yourself tough questions, that's how you get ahead so that you can have these conversations in your organization.
So let's talk a little bit about that, Daniel. So, what was interesting from a timing perspective of when you think about the moment we're in right now, when that occurred in terms of the school year, of course, kids really weren't at school and it was happening at the end of the school year. So I anticipate that we are going to see some kids as we work to try to come back together for in-person instruction, whatever that looks like. And that's a whole other IPA talk for us as we think about that. But when we think about what's ahead here, we're going to have kids coming back and they are going to want to talk about this or express their viewpoint. Brian Schwartz, our general counsel, he and I have talked even about what happens if we have kids that are interested in protesting and how do we work through those issues and try to make sure the kids' voice are heard in an appropriate way, those things. So, you're a former high school principal, of course, and now working in elementary districts. So you've had kind of experience across the spectrum. As you think about this fall for school leaders, what comes to mind for you what advice would you give them about how to handle that as we look at August ahead?
Yeah, I'll tell you, I've already, as this was already kind of hitting the waves really, really hard, I did a personal video to my faculty and staff. And as COVID hit really hard in March, I began understanding that, like, I don't want to send people these long emails for them to have to read as we're living in this environment. I'm going to send video messages each week just to update people. And I sent a video message to my faculty just telling them my perspective, and it was emotional for me. It was raw, it was real, and I shared some of the things I dealt with. But the other thing I shared with my faculty was the fact that I know that they can almost be fooled by having a young African American superintendent to think that the world has changed. See, we've got a Black superintendent. And I told them
or a Black president, right? I mean, same kind of thing. Mm-hmm.
Back to Barack Obama, absolutely. And I told them very clearly that I'm the exception to the rule. You know, that in many of the rooms that I walk in, I'm the only Black superintendent in the room, especially, you know, just in the region that I'm in.
Well, I'll offer, Daniel, for full transparency, there were times you were the only Black board member for IPA, right? Absolutely. I mean, yep, absolutely.
And it's a higher level of responsibility, but it's also a responsibility two ways. It's a responsibility to represent, but it's also a responsibility to bring other people along, to give other people those opportunities to be able to get in that same position and get in the room and a seat at the table. And it's also a responsibility to take advantage of the opportunity and speak and help. So when you ask the question of, you know, as we think about the school year, what advice I would give school leaders, I'm going to give a global advice, and then I'll also give advice for our counterparts who are non-African American and our counterparts that are African American. And the first thing I'll say is to be reflective. We've got to be able to take a moment to step back and figure out what our own biases have been, what we've learned during this time. And I really have found that being reflective is way more progressive than feeling guilt. Now, some people may feel guilt because of things they may have said, things they may have done, and opportunities they may have missed. If there's been things that people have said or done that has been wrong and it was out of ignorance, I lay that on their heart to fix that as a leader, to go back and admit it and fix it and apologize and move forward and be a fighter for the true justice and equity that we need in our schools. But for those who haven't been in those situations where they feel like they've done something wrong in the past, the reflection is really on what they didn't see before and helping them to see it in the future when they deal with it again, so that their response to it can be different as they're leading in their organization. So that being reflective piece, I believe, is really, really important. But the second thing I would encourage teachers to, educators to do, and principals and building leaders to do, is to educate yourselves on the things that you don't understand. And that means you have to, number one, look at things with a different lens. Now that you're exposed to it, now that the scales have fallen off, so to speak. But it also means that you've got to ask questions. Every single person that has contacted me, I respected them to the utmost degree, because it took them a bunch of humility to call another colleague to say, I need help. I don't understand this. Help me to get it. And so now I'm going to give a little bit of advice to our African American leaders. It is our job to help our non-African American counterparts to understand the African American experience. And it's our job to do that with grace and mercy, because people don't understand what they've never been exposed to. And if we don't help them to understand, we are impeding the progress that is trying to occur at this point in time in our life. Yeah. We have to take advantage of this time. And as African American leaders, we've got to speak our voice and help people through understanding it. So to my non-minority counterparts, to my non-African American counterparts, ask questions. To my African American counterparts, answer them gracefully. And last but not least, I say you got to plan for the fall. We are having conversations about what the return to school looks like. How are we going to address trauma? What SEL are we going to put in place? How are we going to help people reacclimate to the workspace, to the school environment? The racial tensions that our country has been living through during this time cannot be off of that list. Yeah. Inequities in our buildings and our systems cannot be off of that list. So we have to be reflective, and we've also got to make sure that in this fall, we're preparing to have these conversations. And if we've got underrepresented groups in our buildings that we feel like we have not given a voice to, That's where we start. Helping our students to see and to know that we see them. And if we don't have good representation on our student councils or in our clubs and our organizations in our building, we may need to pull out minority groups, African American groups, Latino groups, to have their own advisory council and give them face time with their principal, with their building leaders, to be able to share how they feel and how they can ensure that they're receiving what they need to level the playing field in our buildings. That is the equity mindset. And I think our leaders can do it. I would rather our leaders focus on 1 or 2 major things than 5 or 6 minor things.
Right. And
be well at it and be good at it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll just offer, Daniel, where you've been helpful for us, as far as the association goes during your time, and as legislative chair, of course, but then you had started in your role as the superintendent there at District 95. We asked you to come back and facilitate a session for us at our conference a couple of years back, and it was Serving Diverse Leaders was the name of that. And you just had a very frank, transparent conversation with those individuals about things that we needed to be considering as an association. And what I appreciate about that, it caused for us to put a diversity and equity position on our board, and capitalizing now and we've done some things up to this point in time that we're in now, but we're going to capitalize on the momentum of the moment as well. But if we hadn't done that work in advance that you helped move forward, we wouldn't be in a position to where we're talking about now all 21 regions of IPA having, a diversity and equity chair position, talking about those individuals helping us look at things through an equity lens. Like, let's maybe do an audit of all of our model student handbook policies, for example. Do those come through from an equity standpoint like they need to serve districts well? Looking at our professional learning offerings and all of that stuff. So I just want to share, my appreciation. We got a long way to go, and we're not getting it right all the time, and we'll stub our toe occasionally, just more than anything because of the guy sitting in this seat right now. He doesn't always get it right either. Just ask my kids. But I'm grateful for what you've done for us here as an association, and knowing that that's going to have an impact that will reverberate for quite a while. So thank you for that.
No, I appreciate it. It was a great experience, and I know the thing that really inspired me to even help out and want to help out in that capacity was the fact that I know what it's like. And this was once when we talk about an African-American experience from the time I was in college. I would walk into a college classroom, and the first thing that I would do is look around to see how many other African-Americans were in the room. Yeah. And if there was another one, I would go speak to them and make sure that, hey, we're going to make sure we stick together here, and that we've got some help, because and in many classes, I was the only one. In some, it may have been 2 or 3 of us. But that was the experience that I had. And that experience followed me into administration, being a principal. When I would come to IPA conference, I would make sure that if I saw other African-American leaders there, I felt there were a responsibility to make sure, hey, I wanted to introduce myself. I want to let you know what the IPA is about. I want to let you know what the board is about. I want to encourage you to get involved, because we have a responsibility to get off of the sidelines and assist. And the world that we live in is waiting for people to say, how can I help? Yeah. How can I help? And once we walk up into those doors and we figure out how we can help, the possibilities are endless on how organizations like IPA can grow. And I am grateful for your leadership in IPA for stepping out and leading the way on that. It is a huge deal, and it's going to help our kids in the state of Illinois at the end of the day. And that's why we're in this. Yep,
agreed. Well, and I look at, just when you think, as I referenced earlier, about the fact that over 50% of our kids now are African-American, Latinx, or other groups that are not Caucasian, right? But only 15% of our educators are. We've got some work to do there. And I see, what we're doing as far as our diversity and equity efforts go, that to me is the most important thing ultimately that we've got to be working on is how do we encourage more African-American, Latinx young people to consider this great profession of education, so that we get individuals in front of classrooms that are representative of the student body that they have. That is so important, so important. And again, another IPA talk for us, I would say, And I will tell you, Daniel, of course, I appreciate you as a friend and a school leader and the great work that you do. And we could talk a long time here as far as this IPA talk is concerned. But before we wrap this thing up, you as our legislative chair a few years ago, you would represent the association as part of our Illinois delegation that would go out to Congress or to DC, go to Congress, Capitol Hill, those things, and do that in collaboration with our two national affiliate associations, the Secondary School Principals and the Elementary School Principals Association. And I know that you got a really unique opportunity one of those trips. Another high school principal at the time, who still is one, Sean German, had been president of this association. He needed a book signed by John Lewis, the famous civil rights leader, a congressman from Georgia, been in that seat for a long time now. And he needed a book signed by him. And I think, if I recall, the plan was just to swing by the office, drop off the book, maybe come back for it later if he had a chance to sign it. And something very different and special happened instead of that. So I'm going to turn it over to you to just share a little bit about that story.
Yeah, it was an unforgettable moment, and I go back to it often. I know that my friends Sean German and Kevin Shelton and Allison Maley, who was with us, we were walking past the congressman's office, and Sean had his book to be signed, and the plan was to drop it off in there. But we walk in, and congressman's door was open, and he comes out, basically. And we start introducing ourselves to him, and, I share with them we're principals from the state of Illinois, and we're here to do some legislative work on behalf of our state. And he quickly invited us into his office, and his office is like a museum. He's got pictures of everything and everyone and all throughout his life. And he took the time to talk with us about the march to Selma, through Selma. On the Edmund Pettus Bridge, where he was leading the march, where he was coming across that march, was brutally beaten in the fight for voter rights once again in the 1960s. He spent time talking to us about the fight and the movement. And I talked to him about, because the day previous, during some of my free time, I had my wife with me on the trip as well, and we went to the African American Museum. Which was experience that was a roller coaster of emotions, but he was a big catalyst in that African American Museum being placed in Washington, D.C. So I could not miss the opportunity to not only go, but also, as we were talking to Congressman Lewis, tell him two things. Number one, thank you for your service to this country. Thank you for your service to the African American community during the civil rights movement. And I let him know that if he didn't do what he did, I wouldn't be where I was on that day. Yeah. It was a moment that I'll never forget, because he spent probably 45 minutes with us, people who don't have a vote in his community, people who will never have a say of whether or not he walks in that building again or not. And he showed what it means to be a servant leader. He showed in that moment the importance of understanding his place in history and sharing that place with others. And it was a moment that linked myself and Allison and Sean and Kevin and all the principals, the few principals who were with us together on that day, forever and ever, and we'll never forget it. And it was a moment in life that I'll never forget, because I got to tell one of my heroes, thank you for his work. And if we want to really bring it full circle, it was all because of serving IPA. Yeah,
well, appreciate that. And we'll just kind of leave that moment right there, Daniel. I'm grateful for you again, and grateful for your time here. So thanks for joining me for this IPA talk. This has been an important one.
Hey, you can have me anytime. Thanks, Jason. Serving well.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah, my name is Jason Leahy, Executive Director for IPA. With me for this IPA talk has been Daniel Booth, who is now Superintendent of Carbondale Elementary Schools, number 95. As always, if there's anything the IPA can do for you, don't hesitate to give us a call, or you can reach us out on the web at ilprincipals.org. Take care.